Een programma van Zwartwater FM in samenspraak met ufomel.Nederland. Gesprekken met wetenschappers, getuigen en ingewijden wereldwijd. Over de raadsels van het universum, de laatste ontwikkelingen rondom het ufo-fenomeen, de speurtocht naar buitenaards leven en meer. Samenstelling en presentatie Erwin Noorman en Jan Blij.
Ja, goedenavond luisteraars. Het is donderdag 26 mei 2022. Welkom bij Shoreline, de 11e aflevering van dit seizoen. Wat gaan we het komende uur doen? We gaan straks praten met... praten niet, dat hebben we gedaan. Met Ross Coulthard. Hij is bekend geworden van zijn boek In Plain Sight en van de Need to Know podcast die hij maakt met Bryce Zabel. En Erwin en ondergetekende hebben vanmiddag om 12 uur dat gesprek opgenomen, omdat het in Sydney 8 uur later is. Dus wanneer we dat nu zouden doen, dan is het in Sydney 5 uur in de ochtend. En dat schiet natuurlijk voor Ross niet op. Let vooral op zijn spraakgebruik. Hij is echt een eloquente, ik gebruik het woord nooit, een eloquente spreker. Verderop in het programma natuurlijk bellen wij met Terde Smedes en bespreken wij het boek wat hij heeft uitgekozen om te bespreken. En we beginnen met...
Shoreline, de actualiteit. Heet van de pers. Wat is booming? En waar vinden we dat nieuws?
Ja, daarvoor gaan wij praten met Bram Rosa van ufobel.Nederland. Bram, goedenavond.
Goedenavond, Jan.
Hoe staat het leven, jongen?
Het leven staat prima, ja.
Oké.
Ik ga meteen ook een vraag stellen over het leven.
Mm-hmm.
Namelijk, ben je bekend met de theorie van panspermia?
Ja. Het leven op aarde gezaaid vanuit de ruimte.
Juist, ja. Precies. Nou, de hypothese stelt inderdaad dat het leven verspreid in het heelal voorkomt en niet op de aarde zelf is ontstaan.
Mm-hmm.
Nou, is het zo dat eerder deze maand werden dus nieuwe bevindingen bekendgemaakt in een peer-reviewed artikel in het wetenschappelijke tijdschrift Nature Communications.
Mm-hmm.
En dat nieuwe onderzoek suggereert dat asteroïden die op de aarde inslaan alle bouwstenen van het leven op deze planeet kunnen hebben geleverd. Nou, dat is dus eerder was het al bekend.
Mm-hmm.
Maar nu zijn dus althans, het was dus bekend dat er dus 3 van de 5 nucleobasen, dus informatieve eenheden, zeg maar, die dus als basis dienen voor DNA en RNA, dat er dus 3 van die 5 nucleobasen, die hadden we dus al onderzocht. Die waren al bekend dat die in asteroïden voorkomen. Maar nu dus, in dat nieuwe artikel, zijn dus die andere 2 types gevonden door onderzoekers in de Universiteit van Japan.
Mm-hmm.
En dat betekent dus dat DNA waarschijnlijk niet gevormd is in een asteroïde, maar wel de levering van genetische bouwstenen in asteroïden zou teweeg hebben gebracht. En dus de ontwikkeling van DNA hier op aarde mogelijk gemaakt kunnen hebben. Dus die panspermia-theorie is nu eigenlijk zo goed als...
Ja.
Kijk, het is niet bewezen, maar het is...
Nee.
Nou ja, hè? Dus een astrobioloog bij NASA, die heeft ook gezegd, we hebben nu bewijs dat de complete set nucleobasen die tegenwoordig in het leven wordt gebruikt, op aarde beschikbaar zouden kunnen zijn geweest toen het leven hier opkwam. Dus nou ja, het is toch wel...
bijzonder nieuws. Ja, een bijzonder nieuws toch?
Vind ik ook.
En die wetenschap die gaat maar verder met dit soort dingen onderzoeken.
Ja, tuurlijk. Die blijven daarmee bezig. Astrobiologen, dat is koren op hun molen natuurlijk. Ja. Dus dat super.
Dat is een mooi nieuwtje, Bram.
Ja, het is dan astrobiologie en niet per se ufo's. Maar we gaan ook weer terug naar de ufo's. De vorige keer in Shoreline had ik al eventjes gemeld dat het nieuwe documentaire Aerial Phenomenon uitkwam.
Ja.
Nu zijn er deze maand nog 2 documentaires uitgekomen.
Okay.
De eerste is Terror in the Sky. Dat is een documentaire van Caroline Corrie. Eigenlijk bekend van wat meer zweverige documentaires als E.T. Contact, Among Us en Superhuman. Deze keer heeft ze een samenwerking aangegaan met UFO-X. En dat is het onderzoeksteam van mensen die onder andere aanwezig waren bij de UFO-waarneming op het vliegdekschip de Nimitz, waarbij de ondertussen bekende TikTok-UFO werd gezien. Ja. Maar er zitten ook andere wetenschappers tussen in dat team, onder andere Kevin Knuth. En die mensen die gaan dus op zoek naar bewijs voor UFO's in die documentaire. Dat doen ze bij een hotspot aan de kust van California. En op zich lijkt die documentaire meer op een lange aflevering van een serie als zeg maar even UFO Hunters dan echt een documentaire. Maar het resultaat van het onderzoek aan het einde van de rit is toch nog best interessant. Okay. Dus kan je kijken.
Dat zijn documentaires die achter de betaalmuur zitten, Bram, of niet?
Ja, zeker. Dus dat zijn documentaires die je kan zien via Amazon en iTunes. Een beetje dat soort plekken. De tweede docu die uit is gekomen, die heb ik zelf nog niet gezien. Dat is Abduction Answers. En dat is een docu die gaat over het alien abduction fenomeen. Ben ik zelf op zich heel geïnteresseerd in en dus reeds benieuwd naar die doc. Ik weet nog niet precies wat de insteek is, maar Whitley Strieber doet in ieder geval mee. En dat is de man van de bekende Communion boeken. Ja. En daar hadden we laatst ook volgens mij had Tedder daar een boekbespreking over in Shoreline, over Whitley Strieber. En als laatste nieuwtje wou ik nog heel eventjes zeggen dat er een nieuw seizoen is van The Basement Office. En dat is het UFO-programma van de New York Post, die altijd te zien is op YouTube gratis. Stephen Greenstreet en Nick Pope, die jullie ook wel eens hebben gehad in een oud seizoen van Shoreline, hebben dit seizoen echt alles omgegooid. Alles wat we dachten te weten over het geheime Pentagon UFO-programma ATIP en over de directeur daarvan, Louis Elizondo, en alles daaromheen, zeggen ze nu van, dat klopt niet helemaal. Nee. Dus, ga de Basement Office kijken en bedenk zelf wat wel waar is en wat niet waar is.
Ja, daar komt het uiteindelijk dan op neer, hè?
Ja, moeilijk.
Ja, en steeds meer mensen gaan ook meepraten over dit soort dingen.
Ja,
dat is ook wel logisch natuurlijk met al dat nieuws.
Zeker. Maar het is ook op zich ook goed. Ik bedoel, als mensen erover gaan praten, dan betekent dat ook dat ze erover na gaan denken. Dat is op zich
hartstikke mooi, Bram.
Dankjewel.
Ik dank je wel voor jouw toelichting en jouw berichten. En ik wens jou morgen een hele mooie dag.
Dankjewel, Jan.
Dag, Bram.
Dag, joe.
Shoreline. Gast van de week. Opzienbarend en spraakmakend. De diepte in. Een gesprek onder 4 ogen.
Mr. Ross Coulthard, very much welcome to Shoreline Radio. We are very honored to have you in our show. Let me briefly introduce you. You are a multi-award winning journalist from Australia. You are author of the magnificent book about UFOs In Plain Sight. And my first question is, will this magnificent book be translated to Dutch sooner or later?
I'm hoping so. The publisher HarperCollins, based in the United Kingdom, is apparently talking to Dutch publishers at the moment to discuss the possibility of a Dutch translation being done. The best way to achieve that at your end is for your lovely listeners to tell my publisher, HarperCollins or William Collins UK, that they want a copy of the book in Dutch. And essentially it's all driven by consumer demand. So if people email William Collins and tell them they want it, they will get it.
I will surely do that, because I've read more than 50 UFO books, and this is definitely one of the best, maybe even the best UFO book I've ever read.
Oh, wow, that's very kind of you.
It's true.
I started out, I guess, trying to write a book that was for the layperson to come into this subject matter and to understand the phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And in many ways, the book is my story of my discovery as I went through, because I genuinely started out, gentlemen, thinking that I was going to debunk this subject. Mm-hmm. I thought that eventually I'd be able to say that these UFOs, they're all nonsense and we can get on with covering more important stories. But as I became more deep into the history and into the main players in the story, I began to realize it's real. And then, much to my happiness, the US government put a report into the Congress which revealed that they acknowledge that it's real, that this is an authentic phenomenon, and that they cannot explain it.
Indeed. Was there a certain moment when you thought, oh my God, there's something really going on? Was there
Yeah, there was. I was travelling a lot for Australia's version of 60 Minutes, and I was going to and from the United States. And so I was able to meet people in Washington, D.C. and other cities in the United States. And on one particular journey, I met an official from the US Air Force. And I can remember it was very early on in my time. And he had been introduced to me by a friend from the Australian Defence Force. And I was expecting that when I spoke to him about UFOs, UAPs, that he would, like I have done all my career, laugh at the subject and treat it with ridicule and stigma. But instead, he told me that this was a serious subject for investigation, that UFOs were real, that the United States military, particularly the US Air Force and the Navy, were regularly filming and tracking on sensor systems like radar and at-FLIR imaging systems, objects that they couldn't explain. And when I asked him, well, why don't we know about this? Why is this not more publicly known? He said because a decision was made way back, if you look at your history, in the 1950s and 60s, that this should be covered up. And I said, you're an official of the US Air Force and you're telling me that there was a deliberate cover-up? And he went, yes. And he said, not everybody in the Air Force agrees with this cover-up, which is why I'm speaking to you, and you've come well recommended by your friend in Australia. But he said there are a lot of people in the US Air Force who believe that the public should not know what we know. And I said, well, what do you know? And so then he introduced me to people, and I started writing letters to people who I thought might be helpful and persuasive. And before I knew where I was down the rabbit hole, chasing a story I never expected to chase.
Okay, so initially you thought to debunk the UFO case, but you were convinced that there's more.
Yeah, as a journalist in Australia and all around the world, I've worked in British newspapers as well. All around the world, journalists are taught to treat UFOs, UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, with skepticism and indeed with ridicule.
Ridicule, indeed.
It's very, very common in Australia for stories about UFOs to be treated with background music like the X-Files, or for the announcer that's questioning you to have silly photographs of aliens or UFOs, flying saucers on the back screen. And there's generally a kind of a humour directed at the subject matter. When you talk about it as a journalist, it's treated with ridicule.
Yeah, we have been laughed at many times, so we know
and I
what
was
you talk
fascinated
about.
with that.
Yeah.
I was fascinated with that because when I started reading the history, I found in the archives of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, I found files that showed a deliberate policy was made after the Robertson panel to treat the subject with ridicule.
Indeed.
And to stigmatize it and to try to discourage people from reporting UFOs. And officially the official story is that this was done because they were worried about Cold War hysteria. They were worried that what this was going to do was cause a whole lot of false alarms to the Defence Forces and divert the Defence Force of the United States or Australia or Holland from the rightful task of investigating whether the Soviets were coming over the border. But the reality is that excuse didn't really make sense, because by definition, if there are unidentified, anomalous phenomena doing extraordinary manoeuvres in our skies, wouldn't any defence force want to know about that? And I was struck by the illogicality, the irrationality of the explanation. And so when I started, I went through a lot of Australia's history. Australia, to my great amazement, has a long history of investigation of UFOs, right from the 1940s through to around about the 1970s. And indeed, in the early 1970s, there was a man called Harry Turner, who was a physicist, and he had been involved in helping the British do the monitoring of their nuclear weapons testing that was done in Australia in the South Australian desert in the 1950s and the 1960s. And Harry had seen UFOs, and he'd investigated cases where anomalous craft was seen hovering over the nuclear test site, just like they were in the Nevada test range in the United States. And so he became aware that this wasn't rubbish, this was true. And he was eventually to become one of Australia's top defence scientists with a top secret clearance. And so he was going to the American nuclear weapons testing in Nevada, and he was also witness to the tests done in the Pacific. And on numerous occasions, people who attended those tests saw and reported and tracked anomalous phenomena, objects, solid objects on radar. They were videoed, they were seen by thousands of people. And so Harry became aware, as one of Australia's top scientists, that this was a real phenomenon. And so in the files of the Australian archives, in the Defence Department archives, there are these files that show that our top defence scientist was pushing for kind of like a Mulder and Scully. You know, he wanted an X-Files investigation team. He wanted a UFO investigation team, a rapid response team that could immediately respond to UFO sightings and alleged landings and to go and investigate. And unfortunately, the Americans shut him down. The Australian Air Force asked the Americans, well, what do we do about this? Should we do this? And they discouraged the Australians from investigating, as they have done almost every other allied country in the world since World War II. And this was what shocked me, that there was this reality that wasn't being told. And so I was then struck as a journalist. As a journalist, I have a responsibility to look at facts objectively, to assess evidence. And so my worldview was being turned upside down, because I was thinking that I was going to disprove these silly UFOs. And then there was I going through the National Archives of Australia, and I found files that recorded sightings by soldiers and airmen in our Air Force. And I tracked down one. I remember one in particular. There were these two Special Forces soldiers. They were warrant officers with our Special Air Service. And interestingly, for some reason, the file named the two officers. And so I tracked down one of the men just recently. And he went, "Oh, my goodness, I remember I filed that sighting report." And I said, "What did you see?" And he said, "Well, we were going to do a parachute drop at one of Australia's most sensitive airports, because it's right next to a base called the Harold Holt Naval Communications Station." And he said we had about 120 soldiers who were going to jump out of an aeroplane, and we had to make sure that the airspace was clear, and our job was to maintain radio communications and to let the big Hercules aircraft know that it was okay for them to come in. And as they were watching, a gigantic orb, a sphere the size of a big aircraft, came hovering over the landscape at thousands of miles an hour. And it literally hovered over the airstrip and stopped their radios from working. So they couldn't authorize the parachute drop. And whatever it was interfering with their communication systems, and it was quite clearly a solid object. They could see that it was just above them in the airport, and they were absolutely perplexed by it. And so they made a report about it. And to my amusement, I spoke to this soldier and I said, do you think you were mistaken? Could it have been a weather balloon? Could it have been a misidentified aircraft? And he said, Ross, come on. He said, no, it couldn't.
No.
And he said, ever since then, I've believed that there is something else.
Well,
and I said, what do you mean?
That's a credible witness, of course.
Yeah. And he's now in his 60s, late 60s, this gentleman, and he said, Ross, I'm always going to be convinced that what I saw was a craft that was not of this world.
Okay.
And this is the issue. The issue is I've found that when I've actually done the homework, which I should have done years ago as a journalist, and I'm ashamed of myself for not taking this more seriously earlier, I've spiked stories. There's a saying in journalism where you spike a story, you stop the story from running. And so I've been on a news desk in a newspaper and I've had somebody call and I've been party with the editor of the paper to spiking the story, stopping it from going in the paper. And I've received phone calls over the years from people who say they've seen UFOs and I've just treated it with ridicule. I've gone, oh, this is crazy. I'm not talking to crazy people. I'm just going to hang up. And the interesting thing is, when I analysed the evidence, I realised it was real. And then the turning point for me was I was talking to a lot of officials who I'm sure are probably going to end up giving evidence to the Congress in the next few months. And they were telling me, Ross, this is real. We're seeing these objects all the time. Our military pilots have been reporting them for decades. And we think it needs to be investigated because we think our government knows a lot more than it's letting on, and it's now a big issue, particularly for the US Navy, because the US Navy feels strongly that the US Air Force has been hiding this, that it's been concealing evidence and keeping it from the other armed services. And so I slowly started reaching out to people and I can still remember I decided that one of the things I didn't want to do was leave a digital trail because in the same way that you gentlemen are calling me tonight on an app that allows your email to be traced, this digital trail can be tracked and the metadata can be followed back to the source. And so I was very concerned as a journalist who's ethically obliged to protect sources, if I was going to be reaching out to people who were people with national security secrets and oaths of secrecy, I needed to make sure I could protect them. And so I didn't want to ring them and I didn't want to email them, so I wrote them letters.
With
good old-fashioned letters with stamps on them. And good old-fashioned letters. I wrote hundreds, literally about 160 letters in the first incident. Okay. And then I posted them out. I think the post office thought I'd gone crazy. But the interesting thing was I started getting calls because people were amazed that I'd gone to this step of protecting them, and they were grateful because, most times letters aren't intercepted. And one of the people who responded turned out to be a very senior former Navy research scientist called Nat Kobitz. And he was essentially the developer, the head of science and technology development for the US Navy. And he worked at the very highest levels of secret projects in the US Navy for 30 plus years. And one day, sadly, he was dying. He was dying of cancer, which is probably why he was so prepared to be so open with me, because he knew that if he told me what he knew, he couldn't be prosecuted.
There's also a long history of deathbed confessions of many military personnel.
Sure. So I had been reading about what are called crash retrievals. And these are allegations that there are crashed alien, non-human spacecraft technology that has been recovered in secret by the US. And to me, it just sounded like a preposterous claim, a stupid claim. And I'd read a denial from the Barack Obama White House, where the Barack Obama White House under President Obama issued a press release in 2011, and they formally denied any knowledge of any contact with extraterrestrials or their technology. And they formally denied the whole notion of recovered spacecraft.
And it was not only
I was
Roswell.
amazed.
It was more than just Roswell.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'm convinced now there really is something to the Roswell story. And the interesting thing was Nat Kobitz, when I asked him about crash retrievals, I said, were you ever read into a crash retrieval of a UFO, a UAP? And there was a pause. And then he said, yes, but I was never read out of it, so there's not a lot I can say. And when you say you're read into a program, that means you're given the security briefing that means you're allowed to know that top secret, compartmentalized secret of that special access program. And normally it's a code word program, and you can only know that secret. Even if you have a top secret classification, you can only know that secret if you're read into it. And so I asked Nat, what were you told? And he said that the US had recovered multiple spacecraft, alien craft. And
it's quite
I can remember,
it's quite unbelievable.
I remember I had to sit down afterwards and pour myself a stiff drink because it just seemed crazy.
Yeah.
And then Nat was a very kind man. He was a loyal patriot of America. And he actually said to me, he said, look, I don't understand why this is being kept secret. He says, I can't think of any good reason why this is being kept secret other than the fact that they don't like admitting they've been lying to the American people. And so he introduced me to people who I have to keep anonymous, who worked in the program. And they told me that they had been involved in attempting to back-engineer non-terrestrial, non-human technology, or at least not technology from this time zone, this time period. And it blew me away because I suddenly realized I was chasing a conspiracy theory that I had always thought was a lie.
Yeah,
just rubbish.
It used to be classified as gossip and not real.
Yeah. And ridiculed. But I now think it's true. And I do think that even President Trump hinted that there was something to the Roswell story when his son, Don Trump Jr., interviewed him for a pre-election interview shortly before the last presidential election where Trump lost. And in that interview, Donald Trump admitted that he knew something about the Roswell story, but he'd like to tell it. And he couldn't talk about it right now, but he probably would consider talking about it one day. Well, and the interesting thing is, Barack Obama has also hinted that as president, he was briefed on something about UFOs that he's not allowed to talk about. So what could it possibly be if you think that the President of the United States is nominally the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the US? The President at any time can rescind any secret in the US government. He can declassify any secret he wants, even if it's a waived, unacknowledged special access program, the most secret of the secrets. So what is it? This is the thing that intrigues me. What is it that the President of the United States, Barack Obama, was told that he's not allowed to reveal, even if he's the most powerful man in the world?
Yeah, I can imagine. They're shielding right now behind a screen of national security. Yeah? We've seen the hearings in the Congress. To me, it was an insult for educated people to listen to those two people, Moultrie and Bray. Well, what's your opinion about those hearings?
I was brutal. I've got a podcast called needtoknow.today, and I was a bit worried because Americans don't like swearing, but I hope people in Holland and the Netherlands don't mind swearing because I just said it was a turd wrapped up in a bow. You know, I couldn't believe what complete bullshit they were spouting because, You know, there was a whole lot of stuff in that address.
Yeah.
They were asked, for example, about whether there were any knowledge of recovered UAP technology. And did you notice that he used the reply? It was the most weird reply. Rather than just saying no, he said no contractual programs. Did you notice that?
Yeah. That was very peculiar.
Now, the reason that's significant is because there's a document that has been in circulation now for about 4 years called the Admiral Wilson document.
Tom Wilson.
Or the Tom Wilson, the EWD notes.
Mm-hmm.
And my friend in Australia, James Rigney, helped me get access to those notes, and they show, well, at least they reportedly allege that Admiral Tom Wilson, the former DIA, Defence Intelligence Agency chief for the US Defence Department, he allegedly told Eric Davis, who was a scientist working with the Bigelow National Institute of Discovery Science, he told Davis in 2002, in what appears to be an act of whistleblowing, about a secret program that he'd discovered inside the US government that was hiding recovered technology, and that there was an attempt in secret to back-engineer recovered craft. Now, this all sounded crazy to me, but the idea was, as the notes describe, and I should emphasise Admiral Tom Wilson has told me personally that he denies this conversation ever happened, and he categorically denies that there was any such conversation about any such program. But I think it should be investigated, because I'm now aware of multiple serving or former US government officials who are suggesting that there is possibly something to this issue of recovered technology, and that the public, indeed the President, the Congress, may indeed have been lied to. That is a criminal deceit on the American public. And so we're now in a situation where, thankfully, Representative Gallagher, a congressman, asked questions about the Admiral Wilson document in the most recent UAP hearings before the Congress, and it was put onto the public record that the Defence Department now has to respond to the allegations in that document. And this is very, very important, because I can tell you there are congressmen, there are politicians, senators who are determined now to get to the bottom of this. They are determined to try to find out whether there has been a cover-up about UAPs, UFOs.
Do you think that the genie is out of the bottle permanently?
No, I think it's going to take years, I really do. If you've been criminally concealing secrets like this, and you're a senior general in the Pentagon, and you've been hiding this from the President and from senior oversight committees like the House Intelligence Committee or the Senate Intelligence Committee or the Armed Services Committee, you know you're going to jail if you don't have any legal basis for the fact that you've lied to congressional committees. That's how serious this is. People have been intimidated, people have been driven crazy by the harassment they've suffered for trying to investigate allegations of UFOs and retrieved technology on military bases in America. Now, I don't know the truth. I don't know if there's any legal basis upon which this could legally have been done. But I can't think of any solid good reason for why it should still be being kept secret. Perhaps in the darkest days of the Cold War, there was a good reason for why it should have been kept secret. But I just don't understand why. Maybe the US is now in a battle with the Russians to try to develop this technology. Maybe I've been told, for example, sources have told me that the Russians have recovered craft and that they are now, through a military base in the Ural Mountains, trying to back-engineer the craft that they have recovered. I don't know it good enough, well enough, to be able to assert it with any authenticity. I need corroboration. I need witnesses. But the interesting thing is that there are now people coming forward from within the defence and intelligence establishment of the United States. And as you would know, you gentlemen would know, I didn't realise until I looked at the UAP Task Force report that really what it's saying isn't all that new. Because back in the 1940s and the 1950s, what's being said now by the American military, that UFOs are real, that they're a national security risk and that they're a flight safety risk, that was being said by the US Air Force and the US military right back in the 1940s and the 1950s. But shortly after the so-called Washington flyover, where there was an incredible flyover of alleged UAP objects over Washington that were picked up on radar doing an extraordinary speeds. Immediately after that incident, the history shows in documents, there are archival documents to show that the US government made a policy decision through the CIA to cover it up, to basically bully people and to ridicule people into shutting up about UFOs. Now, there never has been any adequate explanation to explain why that's taken place. I mean, it astounds me, really, that we have allowed ourselves, I mean, media routinely asks hard questions of politicians. I've spent a career in my life doing exactly that, confronting politicians about incompetence, corruption, bad political decisions that have cost human lives, and we're often brutal. But what we've done, what the weapon that they used to shut the media down in particular was very effective. They intimidated us into thinking that this was a subject for ridicule. And I can tell you the mood is now changing because people are now prepared to ask the hard questions.
Finally, pilots are reporting more and more. So we've had 400 reports lately.
Yes, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because the UAP Task Force report that was tendered in the Congress on June 25th last year, it was a report that was mandated by legislation requiring that the Congress be given information about UAPs. And it was the first such report, so it was very limited. It only looked at the period from 2004 to 2021. But in that period, they found 144 credible sightings incidents of unidentified phenomena that they were just, despite investigation, they couldn't explain. And only one of those incidents they were able to explain.
There was one inflating balloon,
Yeah, but the interesting thing is, as you say, they've now got up to 400 unidentified phenomena since 2004.
Including 11 near misses with airplanes?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I've been briefed by people on the inside who tell me about the videos that have been shown in confidential hearings in the Congress. They tell me that they are very, very high resolution. And this is one of the great frustrations because the two intelligence officials who gave evidence to the Congress last week, they won't get away with their attempt to deceive the Congress that they quite blatantly tried to do last week. They presented a video that was a ridiculous, fleeting image of a blurred metallic object in a distance.
It was so annoying.
It's absurd. There is numerous sources now have told me about a 23-minute video, high resolution, of a close-up object hovering near a military aircraft. And I think eventually those videos are going to become public.
That would be nice. Finally.
It would be. It would be.
And now you find yourself to be in the heart of the unfolding UAP discussions. How does that feel?
It's kind of weird. I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed in some way because I always thought UFO Twitter was a bit crazy. And let's be honest, some people there are. There are a lot of crazy people. I don't believe some of the more extravagant claims that are made by people like Corey Good, who assert, for example, that we've been fighting wars in distant galaxies and that we're part of a galactic war and that we've already got interstellar spacecraft. It's, I've seen no evidence to substantiate extraordinary claims like that. And I think what's interesting, I'm not asserting that it's Mr. Good that's doing this, but I do believe that there are certain bits of information that have been inserted into the fringe world of UFO social media to try to discredit real sightings. And we know from the Richard Doty, Paul Benowitz story that this is exactly what the US Air Force Office of Special Investigations did. They literally have admitted, Doty has admitted, giving false information to a man called Paul Benowitz to actively try and deceive a UFO investigator. Now, my understanding is that ever since the horrific exposés of the CIA's crimes committed against American citizens in the 1970s, it's a criminal offence for intelligence operations, disinformation, to be run against US citizens. But here we have, on the public record, people who claim to have worked for the US Air Force admitting on the record that they have committed acts of deliberate disinformation against US citizens to try to get them off the story of UFOs. Now, why?
Yeah, why?
The big question is why?
That is the big question.
If there's nothing in this, if these are all BS, if it's all rubbish, why? Why have they done that? And one of the things that journalists like myself develop is a very good nose for bullshit. And what we're dealing with now, we're dealing with bullshit. We really are. And I've decided to call it like I see it. And as you gentlemen probably know, Australians are quite forthright. We don't hold back. We say what we think.
Yeah.
We're very open, and
just like the Dutch.
I like the Dutch sense of humour.
Yeah, they do.
And the thing that amuses me is, I can't avoid saying what I think. And I think last week's UAP hearing before the Congress was a deliberate attempt by two intelligence officials to deliberately deceive and misinform the Congress.
Do you think there's a political will?
They're not going to get away with it.
Do you think there's a political will to push through?
Well, I'm bloody well hoping so, guys, because this is the last opportunity. If this doesn't work, it'll go back and everybody will go back to sleep for another 75 years and they'll be able to keep on doing whatever it is. And I don't think, I'm not confident that this is going to be the big disclosure. I'm not. I do fear that the media, the mainstream media, is not yet behind the story. And I'm aware, for example, that my friend Tim McMillan from The Debrief is, in about a day's time, going to release a very interesting new video that shows objects doing weird things, hypersonic maneuvers, demonstrating what appear to be the 5 observables. And that video has been apparently looked at by experts, and it's describing something that is phenomenal. But I don't think even videos like that convince people. I think even if you landed a bloody flying saucer on the White House lawn, people have got their heads in the sand so completely that they probably wouldn't believe it. And it really sight, is, I think,
in plain sight.
It is in plain sight, and that's why I called my book In Plain Sight. Yeah. And so it really is, I think, incumbent on government to own up, because we've now had 2 former directors of the CIA, 2 directors of national intelligence, 2 former presidents have all admitted that there's something there that they're not allowed to talk about and that it's real. And that is, it should, any journalist doing their job should be inquisitive as a result of those admissions that have been made. But, it's funny, I was in Melbourne earlier this week, which is a different city from where I live in Australia. And I was walking along the street and this young guy came running up to me and he said, Mr. Coulthard, I just want to shake your hand. And I said, oh, why? What have I done? And he said, I just want to congratulate you on your podcast, on your Need to Know Today podcast. And I said, oh, why? What do you like about it? And he said, because you're doing journalism that frankly, should be being done by the mainstream media, but it's not being done. And he said, it's so important, and I just want you to know I'm on your side and I've got your back. And I went, oh, that's really nice of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, but the next coming months... sorry.
No, that's right. No, but the thing that really does frustrate me is that there has been a truth embargo imposed on the media. And I'm not suggesting an active conspiracy by editors to collude with the Defence Department to hide this stuff. But what they've done, what the military and the intelligence services did, was much cleverer. They used ridicule. They used stigma. They told us that it was all rubbish and not to take it seriously, when in fact, as we now know, it's official US government policy now. They've admitted UAPs are real.
Right. That's the best part of the hearings lately. Well, let me... we have to close this conversation soon because we're talking a long time already. What can we expect the coming months from the world and from you?
I'm told there are going to be more hearings very soon, possibly within the next 2 weeks. And this time, they're not going to let the officials off the hook. They're going to call witnesses, and they're going to start getting people to swear under oath what is really going on.
All right.
And I think that's when it's going to start getting interesting. Frankly, I don't know if I'll believe it until I see it, because, you know, I've seen, as a journalist in a lot of areas, I've seen cover-ups a lot. And I still think it's possible that this could be covered up. And it's why public pressure is so important, because this is only happening because the public have been pushing Congress to do this. Politicians only do things when it suits them politically. And the interesting thing is that some of the people behind this push, people like Rubio, people like Warner, these are people who are presidential candidates, people who aspire to be the president. They wouldn't be doing this unless they felt that there was political capital to be gained from doing it. And that's the issue. What I've discovered when I was in the Congress, wandering around talking to different politicians, there is a political will there to get to the truth. And it's bipartisan, both sides of politics, Republican and Democrat. They know they've been lied to and they want the truth.
That's a good ending. Thank you, Mr. Coulthard. Thank you very much for this very interesting interview. Thank you so much.
It's a real pleasure, guys.
Yeah, thank you. In December, I'll be going to Australia. Maybe I can meet you someday.
Yeah. Come on. What are you coming down for? A holiday? Or
holiday. 4 weeks Australia and 4 weeks New Zealand. So I really hope...
come and say hi. No, it'd be lovely to see you. Yeah.
Maybe we'll be contacting you again.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, come and no problem at all. Good to talk to you. And I'd love to know when this is going to air. So if you could send me a link saying where it is and where people can listen to it, I'll put it up on my Twitter feed for you.
We'll do. Thank you very much.
All the best, gentlemen. You have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Shoreline. Over boeken en auteurs. Filosoof, theoloog en schrijver Ter de Smedes over publicaties die je gelezen moet hebben.
Ja, jongens, we hakken van het een naar het ander. Man. Terde, ik zit nog met mijn hand in mijn zakken, met de kaak onderuitgezakt na te luisteren naar die Ross Coulthard.
Ja, dat is er wel. Voor de luisteraar is dit nou wel een beetje een hard gelach dat ze nou ineens door zo'n telefoon... dus in zo'n telefoonsound naar mij moeten luisteren. Nadat ze inderdaad heel mooi zijn meegesleept door de dreunende bas van Ross Coulthard door de speakers.
Wat een mooie stem. Jongen, ik vind het echt een mooie stem. Maar ja, goed.
Ja, geweldig. En die man die kan vertellen dat... hij houdt er waarscheinlijk ook heel erg van om zichzelf te horen. Maar ik moet ook wel zeggen, het is ook wel een genot hoor. Daar kan ik niet over uit.
Nou, maar wij gaan nog een boekbespreking doen met jou. Ik heb al gezien wat je gaat bespreken, Ter, maar vertel eens.
Ja, nou, ik moet zeggen, kijk, de jingle zegt altijd boeken die je gelezen moet hebben.
Ja.
Nou moet ik zeggen, dat moet misschien ook de luisteraar wel even weten, ik word niet gesponsord. Ik koop de boeken zelf. En ik lees ze soms. Nou, het boek van vanavond, dat is het boek van Debbie Ziegelmeyer. En dat heeft als titel The Alien Colonization of Earth's Waterways.
Nou, dat
en dan is de ondertitel, en dat was natuurlijk waar ik op afging, A Reference Guide to UFO Water-Related Activities.
Ja, oké.
En dit gaat dus om... Debbie Ziegelmeyer is een hele hoge pief binnen MUFON. Dus zeg maar die grote Amerikaanse club die waarnemingen inventariseert en onderzoekt. Dus nou, dat had voor mij zoiets van, dan moet dit boek wel heel erg interessant zijn. En het werd ook op Twitter door Jan en Alleman werd het aanbevolen van dit was het boek over die UFO's die met name in de buurt van water of zelfs onder water worden waargenomen. Want Debbie Ziegelmeyer is zelf duiker, heeft zelf een aantal UFO's gezien.
Okay.
Dus ik had zoiets van, nou, dit moet wel het boek zijn. Ik moet heel eerlijk zijn, ik heb de afgelopen week gelezen.
Ja.
En ik vind het verschrikkelijk.
Het is een boek wat je beslist niet gelezen moet hebben, bedoel je?
Nou, kijk, weet je wat het is?
Nou.
Het punt is, het boek inventariseert heel veel gevallen, heel veel casussen, die inderdaad met water te maken hebben.
Ja.
Dus inderdaad veel waarnemingen. En het geeft in ieder geval aan, er is wel degelijk een link tussen UFO's en water. Dat is een ding wat als een paal boven water staat. En dat geeft dit boek heel goed aan. Dat is het positieve wat ik over dit boek kan zeggen. Maar dan, ja, het boek is zo ongelooflijk slecht geschreven. Het is een rommeltje. Er zijn heel veel zinnen zijn niet afgemaakt, kappen halverwege af. In bijna elke pagina zitten wel een stuk of 3, 4 typfouten.
Dat is niet goed, hè?
Nee, dat is niet goed. Maar er zitten dan bovendien ook, heeft zij letterlijk stukken over watergebieden of iets dergelijks van Wikipedia gehaald. En soms is ze zelfs vergeten om het woordje Wikipedia uit de tekst te halen. Dus dan staat er gewoon ineens Wikipedia tussen. Dus ze heeft gewoon geknipt en geplakt.
En dat is ook niet door een officiële uitgever uitgegeven, neem ik aan.
Nee, ik denk, het lijkt wel een uitgever te zijn, maar hier is absoluut geen redacteur aan te pas gekomen. Dit is gewoon aangeleverd en de foto's zijn verschrikkelijk. De foto's zijn niet om aan te zien, die zijn heel korrelig, die laten eigenlijk helemaal niks zien. Dus heeft heel veel foto's opgenomen, die zijn gewoon heel slecht afgedrukt. Er zijn heel veel documenten uit voorjaarverzoeken, die zijn afgedrukt, maar waar niet bij staat waar het nou op slaat. Waar gaat dit over? Wat is dit voor document? En en bovendien, en dat vind ik eigenlijk echt totaal niet, dat mag gewoon echt niet. Ze heeft gewoon stukken van andere auteurs overgenomen. Gewoon uit tijdschriften.
Zonder bronvermelding.
Zonder bronvermelding. En dat geldt eigenlijk voor alles. Dat geldt ook, ze haalt bijvoorbeeld heel veel Russische UFO-casussen aan. Maar dan vertelt ze er niet bij.
Bij Poetin.
Nou ja, ze vertelt er dan bijvoorbeeld niet bij waar ze dan die casussen vandaan heeft, zodat eventueel iemand anders dat kan checken. En er zitten bijvoorbeeld gevallen ook, ze heeft ook hele databases voor MUFON. Die casussen neemt ze gewoon over. Ja, daar zit van alles en nog wat tussen. Er zit ook iemand tussen die gewoon ineens zegt van we worden allemaal besodemieterd door de overheid, want de aliens die hebben de overheden overgenomen, et cetera. Dat wordt als casus opgenomen in het boek. Tussen heel veel andere MUFON-casussen. Waar je gewoon zegt van dit had er gewoon tussen uitgeknipt moeten zijn, zo'n stukje. Ja,
is dit nou iets wat we meer kunnen verwachten? In verband met iedereen wel meeliften natuurlijk op het UFO-nieuws allemaal van tegenwoordig.
Dat is dus het punt. Ik moet echt, toen zo straks Ross Coulthard zei, want kijk, de conclusie van Ziegelmeyer is inderdaad, dat is wat de titel aangeeft, die Alien Colonization of Earth's Waterways. Ziegelmeyer als MUFON-mens is er echt van overtuigd dat de basissen zitten onder water. Ze geeft ze aan. Ze vertelt dus dat de overheden ons hebben voorgelogen, of eigenlijk nu naar boven komen wat UFO-onderzoekers al 70 jaar weten. Namelijk dat aliens van buiten de aarde onze planeet bezoeken. Dat geeft de overheid nu toe. Nou, dat is gewoon allemaal flauwekul. Dit illustreert exact, volgens mij, wat Ross Coulthard in het interview wat jullie hadden zei op een gegeven moment van de UFO-scene zit zo vol met die samenzweringsdenkers. Ja. Dat werkt eigenlijk contraproductief.
Ja, dat
want er zit waarschijnlijk ook gewoon heel veel besodemieterij bij. Het is niet ondenkbaar dat een aantal van die casussen, of zelfs heel veel casussen in dit boek, gewoon bedrog zijn. Opzettelijk bedrog. En zij presenteert het in dit boek als feit. Dus zo'n boek als dit doet in mijn optiek eigenlijk meer kwaad aan het hele UFO-fenomeen dan goed. Dit haalt het niet uit de verborgenheid, maar dit maakt het juist alleen maar dat mensen er nog harder om gaan lachen van jongens, kijk eens wat voor knurften eigenlijk in dit circuit bezig zijn. Want kijk eens naar dit boek, hoe slecht dat was. Dus ik vind het heel jammer. Ik kan eigenlijk vanavond dit boek gewoon echt niet aanraden.
Nee, ik heb de vorige nog in gedachten, Somewhere in the Skies. Die landde deze week op mijn deurmat, dus daar ben ik mee begonnen. En dat is wel een kwalitatief goed boek. Ja,
dat is ook een boek wat in eigen beheer is uitgegeven. Dat heb ik dus de vorige keer besproken. En daar was ik ben altijd heel voorzichtig met dat soort boeken. En ik vond dat een buitengewoon aangename verrassing. Dat had wat mij betreft gewoon echt bij een grote uitgever uitgegeven kunnen zijn. Dat geldt ook voor dit boek. Dat boek van Ziegelmeier, daar werd heel hoog van opgegeven op Twitter. Er waren een aantal mensen die echt zeiden van dit is het standaardwerk over die onderwater UFO's. Ja, en daar is heel relatief weinig literatuur nog over. Het is ook Ook in die hoorzittingen werd daar niet over gesproken. Want dat werd direct naar de geheime zittingen verklaard. Toen er gevraagd werd van zijn er ook van dit soort objecten onder water waargenomen. Toen werd direct gezegd van dit is iets voor de geheime zitting. Ja. Dus er is nog heel weinig echt feitelijk materiaal over. En ik had gehoopt om dat hier meer te vinden. En dat zit er gewoon echt niet in. Ja, misschien zit het er wel in. Maar het is te veel verweven met allerlei andere meuk die onbetrouwbaar is. En die je niet kunt checken, omdat er geen bronvermeldingen bijgegeven zijn. Ja, dat ik niet anders kan zeggen van hier heb je aan zo'n boek als dit heb je niks.
Nou, dat is een goede bespreking in ieder geval, Ted. En dan weten we wat we niet moeten doen. Ik heb nog exact een minuut, Ted. Dan moeten we het afronden.
Helemaal goed.
We hebben nog 2 uitzendingen dit seizoen te gaan. Tot de zomervakantie, zeg maar. Die zijn allebei in juni. En
ik hoop dan weer een leuker boek te kunnen aanbevelen.
Ja, een film mag ook, of een documentaire, dat weet je.
Oké.
Het hoeft niet per se een boek te zijn, het mag ook iets anders zijn, waar de mensen naar kijken of luisteren.
We zullen zien.
Nou, hartstikke goed. Hey, Ted, dankjewel.
Heel graag gedaan. Tot de volgende keer.
We spreken elkaar de volgende keer weer.
Doen we.
Oké.
Hey, dank Jan.
Doeg.